The devastation of the opioid crisis has touched every part of this country and so far really shows little sign of abating. We've heard some of the stories, but physician and Giller Prize-winning novelist Vincent Lam has done more than hear them. As a practicing addictions physician, he dissects the crisis at a personal and professional level in his new novel. The book is called On the Ravine, and it brings Vincent Lam to our studio. And it's a lovely pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
I remember when you won the Giller the first time. That was pretty cool.
It was a shock to me, and it was pretty cool.
It looked like you were in shock. You were an ER doc, right? Like, you haven't been an author for the last 30 years of your life. You're an ER doc, now an addiction specialist as of the last 10 years or so, much before the pandemic hit. What were your observations about the nature of addictions and the opioid crisis once the pandemic hit?
Well, what I saw when the pandemic hit was that people who are vulnerable became more vulnerable as our systems were strained, as we tried our best to take care of everyone in new ways. It became even more difficult to take care of people who already had ongoing issues. So along with the COVID-19 pandemic, there has absolutely been a mental health crisis. Some have referred to it as a mental health pandemic. There's been a great deal of stress, a great deal of anxiety, and that has really hit people who have substance use disorders in a particularly hard way.
Although we did have a couple of doctors on this program who had looked at studies in multiple countries around the world, and they said there's actually a lot more resilience out there among the general population, more than you would think. Did you see any of that resilience in the population that you focus on?
Sure, and I think that's true as well. And I think that we can talk about both things at the same time. We can talk about places where people have fallen through the cracks, and we can also talk about the ways in which people have been resilient. And certainly, folks who are experiencing a substance use disorder are just like other people in that they're trying to find new solutions, trying to figure out a way to get through their day, get through their week. And we certainly saw a lot of that as well.
Let me set up this next question by saying that the book, every other chapter or so, features a letter from Dr. Chen, who is the protagonist of the book, to a medical student. And I want to read a little excerpt of that right now. So, Sheldon, if you would, let's bring this up. Here's part of the note written to a student of medicine, and it goes like this. Modern chemistry has gifted medicine with molecules that are both wonderful and seductive. Part of our jobs as physicians is to employ the cleverness of medicines, but we easily become infatuated with them. Then we risk forgetting another part of our work, which is to restrain the mischief of these potions. Morphine relieves pain until it ravages the user with suffering. We have a sanguine expression, the risk-benefit balance, as it applies to our patients. Perhaps we should also point out our own trade-off, the cleverness-wisdom tension. Let's pick up on that. The cleverness-wisdom tension. What does that refer to?
Well, the cleverness-wisdom tension is something that we see everywhere in modern healthcare. And what I mean in using this phrase as a writer, and what I think Chen means in talking about it as the character of Chen, who is a doctor, is that we're really, really good at technical innovation. So we're great at figuring out new machines, new drugs, fancy things that produce wonderful images, clever procedures, and we're always seeming as if we're playing catch-up in terms of systems and in terms of figuring out how to best match the right resources with the right patients in a way that delivers the most benefit for society. And that's the wisdom part that I think we really need in our system. And certainly I think all of us experience that in very tangible ways if we're in the Canadian healthcare system, because we know on one hand that we potentially have access to amazing resources in the intensive care unit, in an operating room if we get a surgery. But at the same time, we know it's difficult sometimes to access primary care. It's difficult to access services that we need. And so we really need the cleverness piece to be matched by the wisdom piece.
Given what we now know about what percentage of the population will become addicted to opioids if they are prescribed for them to deal with pain, do you still think it is a good idea to prescribe those drugs for people suffering in pain?
Well, as with any prescription, the really key thing to do is to be able to match a reasonable prescription to a particular situation. So there's no prescription, whether it's antibiotics or cholesterol medications or opioids, which is just good for everyone all the time. Everything needs to be in an appropriate context and selected for a particular situation. And so when we think of opioids, we can certainly think of many situations in which they're absolutely a gift to the person who needs them. Say someone who's got a terrible fracture that needs to be fixed. Say someone who has terminal cancer and is going to pass away and really will welcome the relief that opioids bring for those last few days and weeks. Those are really, really clear cases where opioids are a gift to those people and to society. And then there are many other examples in which opioids may seem like the right thing and may feel like the right thing in the short term, and yet may ultimately cause a great deal more harm than benefit.
Well, let me pick up on that, because again, your protagonist in the book, Dr. Chen, prescribes opioids for opioid addiction. What is the thinking behind that strategy?
That's a really important thing to talk about. So, in fact, the most evidence-based treatments for opioid use disorder are, in fact, opioids. And they are opioids, but they're opioids with very particular characteristics prescribed in a very particular way. So while most of the opioids that we use, say, for a broken arm or to perform a surgery, are short-acting, they go on, they go off relatively quickly, the opioids that are used to treat opioid use disorder are long-acting. So they have durations of actions which are measured in days as opposed to minutes and hours. This is incredibly important because the goal in the scenario of helping someone who has an opioid use disorder is to help them to be stable, to stabilize disrupted physiology, and in doing so, to give them room to do the things in their lives which are really important to them. And that's a very different goal than when we're using opioids in the context of a very sudden severe pain, where we're trying to match that sudden severe pain with a quick response using medications.
Should we get a little political here?
Well, if you must.
I must. This has not simply been a scientific or medical area of discussion, particularly recently, because the leader of the opposition in Ottawa, Pierre Poilievre, has been outspoken about so-called safe supply, and essentially he thinks it doesn't lead ultimately to a drug-free life. It just keeps people in their current state of addiction. Okay, this is your front lines every day. What does the evidence you see point to on that front?
Well, I think the first thing that I would say is that I think it's a mistake for specific medical issues to become partisan issues. And we can imagine if we had leaders of various political parties advocating for one form of chemotherapy versus another form of chemotherapy, we would say, well, that doesn't ring true or make sense, because
actually, we'd say, what the hell do they know?
Yeah, well, you could say that. I would try to, to say
You'd
something.
Be more diplomatic about it.
Perhaps more diplomatic.
Yeah.
But I think that your point is well taken, and I do think that would be the wrong set of people to be offering opinions on specific medical choices. So I think the role of public discourse is to figure out what our goals are. And hopefully through the political process and the process of public discussion, to figure out, okay, what are we aiming for as a society? Just as we would try to figure out, okay, so do we want people to receive care for cancer? Well, yes, we do. Well, let's get some cancer care experts and figure out what they think should be done. Similarly, with respect to substance use disorders, we should be saying, okay, well, do we want to help people who are experiencing substance use disorders? Well, absolutely we do. These are our fellow Canadians who are struggling with difficult problems. Absolutely we want to help them. Let's ask some people who are experts in the field. So this is a long-winded way of getting to your question. The difficult thing with PSAD, public supply of addictive drugs, also called safe supply, is that currently the evidence is quite limited. The best evidence is for OAT, opioid agonist therapy, which you and I have already talked about. And that is long-acting medications like methadone, like buprenorphine, prescribed in a certain way, in a very controlled way in order to promote stability. PSAD, or safe supply, is short-acting opioids prescribed in quite a different way. And unfortunately, there isn't any evidence at this point to really clearly substantiate the hope. And so the hope is a very important hope. And I feel the deep hope of people who support these practices, because the hope is that PSAD will reduce overdoses and reduce deaths. At the time of this conversation, there's no published evidence that that's actually the case.
Well, here's where it gets even trickier, and that is when people are going about their daily business, they are not tripping over cancer patients on the streets, at least not knowingly, in the same way that they are knowingly tripping over people who are addicted to opioids in the streets. And therefore, this has become a much more political issue than, say, the example you gave about cancer patients. Can we therefore conclude that politicians are going to get involved in this, and at the end of the day, this is going to be a very political issue that politics will decide in the way that it does?
Well, I think part of public discourse is to discuss where politics properly has a role and where it doesn't.
And you think it doesn't here?
I don't think that partisan politics really has much to contribute to specific choices around medical treatment.
Okay. Do you think there is a cure for opioid addiction at present?
So if you ask if there's a cure to an opioid use disorder, then you really have to ask, how many chronic diseases do we have for which there is a cure? And the answer is not very many. So if we think about diabetes, if we think about high cholesterol, if we think about most instances of cancer, we're really looking at treatments that alter the trajectory of that condition. Now, altering the trajectory can be incredibly valuable.
But it's not a cure.
Well, here's what I would say, right? I would say in everything there's a statistical distribution, right? Some people will have a problem with opioids, and at some point will stop using opioids and may even stop using all forms of opioid maintenance treatments, and will go on with their lives and have rich and productive lives, and not encounter opioids again in those lives. Now, I would say the most important thing is that they are living their lives the way they want to. Other people will be treated and will be maintained on treatments. Some of those people may occasionally use illicit opioids, and if they are also living the kinds of lives, doing the kinds of things that they want to do, then I would say that's also extremely successful.
Let's do another excerpt from the book. Here's something you wrote right near the beginning. Like so much of our lives, the plot of this book is driven by desire. The desire to feel a certain way, the desire for things to happen as we hope they will, the desire to help those around us. The book is also driven by the question, what does it mean to help someone when the things they desire are consuming them? That is a brilliant question. You have written, I'm going to check here, like almost 360 pages trying to get to that answer. Are you closer to it now?
You know, I think when you ask that question, the hard thing is that you end up with more questions
Indeed, yes.
than answers. and that's where fiction becomes really important, right? So the big failing of the tweet or the social media post, which is this long, is that it leads to the desire for a categorical answer. Black, white, yes, no, this, that. And some things in life just aren't like that. So Claire, the violinist, who is tremendously talented and who has had her life really seriously impacted by opioids, she's not necessarily looking for a yes or no answer. She's looking for expressions of art. She wants to make beautiful music. Chen has been doing medicine, I think, for too long to think that there are easy answers. but he hopes to have better answers. And better answers come with better questions.
You know you're going to get this question, so this is not going to come as any surprise to you. You've written this in novel form. This is not nonfiction. But I have to believe that all of this is plucked right out of your daily experiences. At least that's what I was thinking when I was reading the book. So do you want to confirm that for me right now, that basically all the characters in this book, they may be fictitious in the novel, but they're absolutely real? Fair?
Well, I can tell you with...
You're going to mess with me. I can tell already the way you're about to wind up this answer. I can tell you're messing with me already, but go ahead.
I can tell you with the greatest honesty that is absolutely true and absolutely not the case.
That's
you sensed
very
helpful
helpful answer.
Coming. So,
very helpful answer.
You know, in terms of the facts, the specifics, the details about characters, both the doctors and the patients, those are absolutely fictitious. So the character whom we meet most often, Claire, is a violinist. And one of the reasons that I chose a violinist is, in fact, because I don't have any violinists who are patients. So, in fact, I make choices in terms of the details that are specifically and demonstrably fictitious. But the things that people experience, the emotional dynamics, the ways in which people are choosing between imperfect choices in a difficult world, yes, this is absolutely real. And so I'm really fortunate because I have two kinds of freedom in this book as a writer. I have the freedom that comes from knowing the world and being able to inhabit the emotional structure of the world. And then I have the freedom of it being fiction and being able to have these characters do all kinds of things which I may have wondered about, but thankfully they've never done.
Well, okay, let me push you a little bit on that, because there are some moments in this book that are truly grim, and there are people who are in serious trouble. And there is this Dr. Chen, who coincidentally happens to be an Asian doctor, kind of like the author. This doctor is, I mean, he's got his heart on his sleeve. He is trying like hell to save every life he can save. And he runs into some extremely frightening, violent, difficult circumstances. Have you?
Yes. Yeah, I have. So, you know, the really difficult thing, which I know as a doctor, and which Chen knows as a fictitious doctor, is that one is always inhabiting these two ways of thinking about an issue. So I'll answer you plainly. You know, I've been threatened. I've had my furniture thrown around the room. I've had the window of my clinic smashed. And so, you know, one can think about this in a couple of ways. Of course, one, as a human being, thinks about safety and thinks about being threatened, which is frightening and it's not pleasant. And at the same time, as a physician, as a doctor, one is also thinking about this situation with a diagnostic sense, trying to understand what's going on. One is thinking about it from the point of view of trying to manage the clinical situation. And there's a slightly circular way in which that second kind of thinking provides a form of comfort, because then one can think, aha, I'm a doctor. I can diagnose or speculate about the diagnostic reasons for which this person is perhaps behaving in an aggressive way and saying unpleasant things. So this is part of the inner life, I think, of many doctors, and it's certainly part of the inner life of Chen.
I'm not finished with the comparisons. We're doing another one.
All right.
Dr. Chen...
Incredibly good looking, right?
Without question.
Is that it?
Without question. Dr. Chen seems very emotionally invested in the fate of his patients, to the point where, there's almost a kind of desperation to the way he tries to help them get better. And I presume that if they don't, he is deeply emotionally scarred and adversely affected as a result. Is that the case for Dr. Lam as well?
Steve, I am deeply invested in the well-being of my patients. Taking care of my patients is one of the greatest privileges I've ever had. and is incredibly important to me, not just as a physician, but as a human being.
In which case, I know how Dr. Chen copes with loss and difficult times, because it's all here in the book. How does Dr. Lam cope?
You know, I cope with difficult feelings, with difficult experiences, in much the same way that I try to help my patients cope with these situations. So I try to find things which I can choose in my life, which move me in the direction of me living the kind of life that I want to have.
Like
and
what?
So for instance, cycling. And I'm just, going to say that Dr. Chen is a cyclist as well.
Small world.
Fancy that. Mm-hmm. Cycling is very important to me. It's a form of physical exercise which suits me. It can be solitary, it can be social. Daily routines which are healthy are incredibly important to me. I'm not perfect. I have a great weakness for certain flavors of potato chips. But it's really important to me to give time and attention to eating in a healthy way, to trying to sleep regularly as much as possible. And I think most of all, the thing which I try to do and which I try to help my patients with is I really try to give room to acknowledge difficult thoughts, difficult feelings. And this is something which we're not taught in our culture. We're taught, if something feels bad, get away from it, get rid of it, do something. We're not taught that we actually have to make room for a lot of hard stuff, because in that hard stuff, there's a lot of meaning.
Mm. Do I assume that writing books such as this are part of your catharsis for dealing with what you deal with in real life?
I wouldn't quite say that. I think that what happens for me in writing books is that it's like turning up the resolution on the image and going from that, that whatever the resolution is, that 640 by 480.
Oh, very good.
Is that the right number?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, all right. From that sort of grainy image to an HD image on a high-resolution monitor, you can really see the details, the emotional details, when you write about emotional territory that you know. And in some ways, I think that's far more the case when writing fiction, because in fiction, I'm unconstrained by the constraints of what actually happened, and I can write the things which I imagine could have happened.
Well, speaking of imagining, my last question here is going to be a bit plucked out of the imagination of the reader. The book is called On the Ravine, which sounds eerily similar to intervene or even intravenous. Was that part of your thinking with the title?
So, I'll tell you, Steve, until the very last moment, so I worked on this book for 8 years, and until, say, year 7, the book was going to be called Double Blind. And that name in itself was kind of a double entendre.
Yeah, like the tests you have to do.
Like the tests, and also referring to some of the dynamics in the book. And wouldn't you know it, right before I finished, someone else published a book called Double Blind.
Damn them.
Someone in England. Those royalists are always getting the scoop on us. Uh-huh. And so I had to come up with another name. The geography of the book, with this house set up on the corner, on the edge of a ravine, was already in play. I didn't think of the references that you have pointed out, although I can understand them. I did think of another book, In the Ravine.
As opposed to On the Ravine.
Mm-hmm. A book by Chekhov, of course. And so that perhaps was resonating within the choice of On the Ravine.
Gotcha. Okay. You know what? I'm really glad we had this conversation, because I thought I knew a lot about Dr. Chen beforehand. And now, having spoken to you, I think I know more about him, and of course more about you. All to the good. On the Ravine, not Double Blind, On the Ravine is the name of Vincent Lam's latest, and we are delighted that it has brought him, even though this is tough subject matter, to our studio tonight for this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.